Welcome to Mr. Rodman's Top 12 Highlights of Chapter 11, and this is a double issue, so fasten your safety belts. We're going to go through these two top 12 highlights of Chapter 11 because there's so much great content here. We're going to go at living the 5 speeds, so buckle up. Here we go. Let's talk reapportionment. Every 10 years, we conduct a census, and we find out the total population of the country. We divide it by 435, and that tells us how many people should be in each district of the 435 House seats that we have in the House of Representatives. That basically allows us to reapportion the 435 seats of representation in the House to those members. On average, as we did this in class, it tends to be about 770,000, 780,000 per district. And then that determines, based on the population of the state, how many seats each state is reapportioned. And then from there, each state will go on to what we call redistricting. That's when they know how many seats they have, and then they will create those districts to make sure that they're equal. As we talked about with Baker versus Carr, so that one person equals one vote no matter where it is, whether it's in Waxahachie, Texas, or Camden, New Jersey, or Seattle, Washington, Chicago, Illinois, wherever the case is. The idea is each district would represent the same amount of people no matter where you live in the United States, and that's the idea of redistricting. Now that's where we get into a lot of the gerrymandering that we talked about in class, this idea that different districts can represent the people in different ways. They can be red, they can be blue, they can be a combination red or blue, or they can be majority red or majority blue. It just depends on how the district lines are drawn, and this has obviously elicited a lot of controversy, going all the way back to Governor Elbridge Gerry back in the 1800s. The idea of redistricting has lots of political consequences. There have been states calling for redistricting based on a nonpartisan panel of retired judges, which they've been calling for in California, but as yet it is still very political in terms of the process, and usually the governor or the legislature determining how and who are drawing those district lines. But Baker versus Carr basically said one person equals one vote, and anything else other than that one person, one vote rule is unconstitutional. It's illegal. This going back to Tennessee Republican Baker complaining the legislature hadn't updated the districts, and the concern there that was that the Supreme Court said, hey, you can't just continue the same districts thinking that you don't have to redraw them. The population changes every 10 years, and the districts should reflect that. So that 10-year redrawing of the lines is crucial and significant in that these districts need to make sure that they reflect the changing population, the changing diversity, the changing demographics of the country, district by district, and that was the importance here of Baker versus Carr. Can the states draw their congressional districts in vastly different sizes and populations? Well, here's where we get into that conversation that we talked about in class about making sure that they're compact. We know that districts aren't always compact, as we saw with some of the Maryland districts. We also know that they have to be concise, they have to be contiguous, and there can be no cracking or packing. And this leads us to the conversation that we had with the district lines in Maryland. How could these possibly be legal if they are? We would have to go back and apologize to Governor Gerry for all the trouble we gave him when we look at District 3 and District 4 in Maryland, with all of the problems with those district lines, and so far the constitutionality that's been upheld by them. The Supreme Court and lower courts are basically upholding those districts. So to be continued. We'll see what happens. But Shaw v. Reno basically said that cracking and packing, you can't do that. You can't violate a minority group by packing them all into one district, therefore diluting their voting value in multiple districts, and you can't crack them by diluting their voting value in one or two districts by cracking them up into 4 or 5 or 6 districts so they have no voting power whatsoever. This was a 5-4 decision, but it was basically saying that redistricting on the basis of race is unconstitutional according to the court under Shaw v. Reno. Now let's talk about the Congress because that is the bulk of the chapter here, and now that we've gotten them elected, let's see what kind of advantages they have as an incumbent or as a person who is currently holding the office. They have the franking privilege. They can send free mailings up to 3 months before the election hits, basically talking about all the wonderful things that's happening in their district. They can share constituent service or casework in terms of helping out a constituent with a government matter, maybe connecting them with the Social Security office or writing a letter to the Naval Academy on behalf of your son or daughter that wants to go there. They also have the advantage of name recognition. They're going around for 2 years in the House and 6 years in the Senate talking about the things that they're doing in your district, hearing what problems you have, trying to raise those issues on Capitol Hill. All of those things helping them with name recognition. It's also easier to raise money when you know who the people are, when you know who's holding the rubber chicken dinners, who's shaking hands and kissing babies, what interest groups might support them on their issues, and having the experience and the voting record to be able to say, hey, I voted for this issue. Hey, I care. Hey, I'm bringing home the bacon in terms of earmarks and pork that's coming back to our districts, and I can show you what I'm doing in Congress. All of these are advantages that someone who's a challenger that's running against an incumbent does not have. Now, Madison had concerns about this in terms of interest groups weighing in and having too much help with incumbency advantage, trying to basically divide up those pluralistic tendencies by creating this bicameral body, a House and a Senate, that basically had different terms, different constituencies, different ways of being elected, and obviously different interest groups that would be supportive of their issues. So this idea of bicameralism, having 2 bodies, 2 chambers, the House and the Senate, in addition to the pluralistic tendencies of our government through 3 different branches, through different levels of government, national, state, local, town governments, in addition to county governments, in addition to city governments, in addition to state governments, in addition to the national government itself. So different sets of rules, different procedures. How could one interest group possibly weigh in on all of those, and bicameralism tying into that pluralism of government in order to minimize the effects of factions or interest groups that would influence them. That leads us to the powers that Congress has through the elastic clause of Article 1, Section 8. That idea of so-called implied powers, powers not explicitly named in the Constitution, but exist due to their ability to have rules and powers in order to carry out these things that are enumerated. And let's look at those 18 enumerated powers, such as collecting taxes and paying debts, borrowing money, regulating commerce, the rules of naturalization and around bankruptcy, how someone declares bankruptcy, all of that, and enumerated powers of Congress. They can also coin and regulate money. They punish counterfeiters. They establish the patent rules and rules for postal routes and post offices. They established the lower courts. The Judiciary Act of 1789 basically establishing how the court system below the Supreme Court is run. All of that the power of Congress, punishing piracies and felonies, the power to declare war, to raise armies and to maintain them, as well as a navy, and to govern those land and naval forces, to calling for a militia and supporting laws that are made within the Union, to discipline that militia and to have a reserve army, to exercise powers over the District of Columbia and the D.C. government, and any other laws which, again, under that elastic clause, shall be necessary and proper. We see here that they have the power to promote progress and protect patents, to naturalize citizens and to declare war. But Where do we see that there's oversight of these things? This is where the implied powers kicks in. Because they have the power to do these things, they have the power to hold hearings and have oversight of these functions of the executive branch that enforce these laws. So these are implied powers that we see through the enumerated powers here in terms of the oversight and the holding hearings. It's just one example of the implied powers through the elastic clause that Congress has. In terms of differences between the House and Senate, obviously the size is one factor. The House being elected every 2 years, 435 members, every seat up for election every 2 years, versus the Senate, which runs for a staggered 6-year term, a third of the seats up every 2 years, and ultimately over a 6-year period, all 100 seats are up for re-election. The leadership is different in that we have a strong House Speaker in the House that has very sweeping powers. We have a weaker leadership in the Senate because all members have more power to basically have control, but we have more freedom within individual members to basically weigh in and what the majority leader is setting as the agenda. The legislation is made by the majority in the House, where one senator can block action under the unanimous consent rules in the Senate. Amendments are much harder to add to legislation in the House, and they're generally allowed in the Senate. Debate is strictly limited, usually to an hour on a topic, in terms of both sides being able to speak in the House. Debate is unlimited in the Senate, and while there are actions that can stop a filibuster, usually 60 votes, depending on the issue, in the Senate. The debate is limited to 1 hour. Not everybody gets to speak. The leadership in each party basically decides who's going to speak in that limited debate, and the Rules Committee is going to decide what committee sees that bill, how long the House is going to vote on that bill, and how that is going to basically work its way through the House of Representatives. Very different in terms of their approaches. And in terms of what's set out by Congress, by the Constitution, all tax bills must originate in the House, and the Ways and Means Committee would get those bills. The advice and consent of the Senate to approve nominees made by the President to the Supreme Court and to the Cabinet are specific roles that are constitutionally powers given to the House through taxation and through the Senate of advice and consent. So these are the roles that they play there. The Speaker of the House having sweeping powers, presiding over the functions of the day-to-day. Again, people sitting in for the Speaker. He doesn't sit there all day, every day, but there are people that are members of his party that will sit in that role in conducting business. The power of the Speaker is very sweeping. They basically will set the agenda. They will assign who's on committees in terms of the Rules Committee that will basically function as a very powerful arm of the Speaker. They will also determine who are the committee chairs and who are presiding officers within the House and within the functions that happen within the House. So the Speaker has very sweeping powers here. This is the leadership that is under the Speaker on the House side, and in the Republican leadership we see the Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House being Paul Ryan, by the way, from Wisconsin, Kevin McCarthy from California. We have Majority Whip Steve Scalise, and then Republican Conference Chairman, basically trying to organize their party, and then Policy Committee Chairman under that, heading in terms of how do they develop policy on their side. They are in the majority party, so they are Republicans in this regard, and the Democrats are in the minority. So Nancy Pelosi from California heading up the Democratic leadership as the minority leader in the House. The Democratic whip or the minority whip in the House is Steny Hoyer. He's from Maryland. Then we also have the assistant Democratic whip that is James Clyburn. I believe from South Carolina, and then the Democratic Caucus Chairman, again looking at policy and so forth, Xavier Becerra from that regard. So that takes us through the powers of the House. Now let's go over and again we looked at the differences between the House and Senate. So let's look a little closer at the Senate. The Senate, constitutionally, the head of the Senate is the Vice President, but the Vice President isn't usually there. They basically preside over the Senate if there's a tie, and as we know constitutionally under the 25th Amendment, they basically have the power in the event that the president is incapacitated. They would take over for the president, or if something were to happen to the president, and heaven forbid they were to be assassinated or die in office, the vice president would step in to become the next president. But in terms of presiding over the Senate, this is usually the president pro tempore, which right now is Orrin Hatch of Utah. He is the longest serving member of the majority party. So the president pro tempore basically takes the place of the vice president when they are absent, presiding over the Senate and holding business. Usually, again, it's not always the president pro tempore that sits in this position, but members of the majority party, in this case the Republicans, that will fill in basically running the Senate in that capacity. But when the president pro tempore is there, Orrin Hatch of Utah, he would be presiding officer in lieu of the vice president, who is not normally there. But the real the real power in the Senate here is governing over the majority leader, and that would be Mitch McConnell from Kentucky. He is the one who is chosen by the majority party, and he is basically the one who sets the agenda. There isn't a rules committee here because the Senate is smaller. They don't need one. They have a lot more informal setting in terms of how long they carry on and talk about a bill. This is where we have the filibuster invoked, and cloture, basically 60 votes to shut down a filibuster. But this really does balance out the legislative branch. Where we see the whims of the masses and the majority ruling in the House, we see that the Senate, the minority is protected. We see that in the Senate, things are cooling off, and they're not the heated whims of the masses and the tempers of the majority like we see over in the House. We see a lot more cautious and deliberative debate in the Senate, much more so here than over in the House. And here is the majority leader, Mitch McConnell. You see the minority leader, Harry Reid, obviously being replaced by Chuck Schumer in this 115th session of Congress. Orrin Hatch is the president pro tempore, the presiding officer, again the member of the majority party with the most seniority. He's been there the longest. We have the majority whip, John Cornyn of Texas, and the minority whip, Dick Durbin of Illinois. And this is their expanded Democratic and majority Republican Party in the majority, the Democratic Party in the minority here in terms of the roles that they play. We talked about the filibuster and the obstructionist tactics. How do we end a filibuster? Otherwise, filibuster is basically unlimited debate. If you cannot close down a filibuster through cloture, which typically is 60 votes, a 3/5 vote of the Senate, the filibuster basically continues and the bill will die. And that is one way to kill a bill in the Senate. You do not have this power in the House. It is not a constitutional power, by the way. It is not constitutional. It is a part of the Senate rules. So constitutionally, they have the power of advice and consent. They have the power to approve treaties, but they don't have a constitutional power to filibuster. It's just a power through the Senate rules, and they can change those rules at any time with a majority vote. Types of committees that we see in the House and in the Senate, obviously permanent or standing committees are the ones that are most important. I always say they're the ones with the names on the door because they're standing, they're always there. The select or special committees, the conference committees, they come and go, joint committees as well. They come and go, but the standing committees are always there. They're the ones with the names on the door because they're the ones that we always see from year to year and Congress to Congress. So those such as Ways and Means or or Judiciary Committee, or the Financial Services Committee, Armed Services Committee. These are standing committees. They're sticking around. They're not changing just based on the party in power. We have joint committees, those that the House and the Senate are coming in on. This is would be an economic committee or a taxation committee. They're looking at reforming the tax code. They would pull together a joint committee to do so. A select or a special committee could be on something like investigating Watergate or on 9/11. A special committee to inaugurate the president, for instance, is what we have every 4 years. And so we would see that type of committee taking shape in order to for a specific purpose and then disappearing once the inauguration is over. A conference committee is basically reconciling the bills that are approved in the House and the Senate. So we see a conference committee coming together, members of the House and the Senate, in order to reconcile those bills. And the idea there is that they're working it out so they can then send it back to their respective houses in the House and Senate for an up or down vote. So that's the big idea there. Now, in addition to committees, we also see caucuses in Congress. These are not caucuses like the Iowa caucus. These are caucuses in terms of interests, and think of it like interest groups in Congress. Members of Congress that are members of these caucuses are members of these particular groups. One of the most famous ones, as we talked about in a team challenge, was the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the Women's Caucus, or the Congressional Caucus for Women's Issues. These are some pretty national in scope, and they tend to stick around. These are caucuses that have been around for a very long time. But these are a similar ideology of a caucus, and while we do see there is a potential to cross party lines, many of them do tend to have some party loyalty there in terms of the caucuses. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly in terms of how a bill becomes a law because we've spent a lot of time on it in class. But basically, the bill is introduced in the House or the Senate. Let's look at it in the House first. It's then referred to a House committee or subcommittee. The report out, if it survives that subcommittee, then goes to the full committee for a vote, for hearings. This is where they would call in witnesses, call in the bill author, call in expert testimony to speak, and if the bill survives, it would go to the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee decides how long are we going to debate this bill on the floor of the House, what type of debate are we going to have, and then when are we going to shut it down and go to a vote. If it passes all of these things and it passes the floor vote, it would then go over to the Senate, and then in the Senate it would be also referred to a committee or a subcommittee. It would then be reported out by the full committee. There is no Rules Committee here, so by the full committee it would then go to the floor. The majority leader would decide when it gets brought up for a vote, if it gets brought up for a vote. And again, it's not the Rules Committee here that's deciding that, it's the majority leader. And if it passes floor action, it's already gone to the House. So if it passes on the floor of the Senate, it would then go to a conference committee. And then they would work out the differences between the House bill and the Senate bill. If there aren't any differences, then it would go on to the president. But if there are, it would go back to both chambers for an up or down vote, and then go on to the president down Pennsylvania Avenue to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House for the president to either sign, veto, or pocket veto. If he signs it into law, great. If he vetoes it, then Congress has a chance to override it, but both houses have to override it by a 2/3 majority. And if they pocket veto and Congress is still in session, the bill becomes law. If the president pocket vetoes the bill and Congress is not in session, the bill would die. Okay, so in terms of committees, we see markup of bills is basically when the committee is basically going line by line through a bill and deciding on what changes to make to it. Again, to report out a bill, the committee would need to vote on it. The only exception to that is a discharge petition, in which a committee, through a vote, can decide that they want to, even though the committee may have voted it down, they decided to send it on to the House anyway. That is basically overruling the rules of the committee and the leadership. You need a pretty strong resurgence of people within the majority party to go along with that in order to make that happen, and that is rare. It does happen, but it is rare in terms of that. So in the House rules, there is what we call a closed rule, which is basically no amendments, very limited limited debate, and we vote. Open rule, a lot more amendments permitted, a kind of open season. And then restrictive rule, basically there's some amendments offered, limited debate, and we have very specific rules on when we're going to vote on that. You don't see any of this type of thing in the Senate. Again, the House needs to be much more formal. It needs to be much more regulated because you have 435 members, where in the Senate you only have 100. So that's a big difference there. Now, what kind of resolutions can the House and Senate pass? You have a simple resolution, which is basically one House is passing a resolution that affects that House. You have a concurrent resolution, both chambers are passing it. And then you have a joint resolution, and this is typically one that is passed by both chambers, signed by the President, with the exception of a constitutional amendment, basically for the purpose of both chambers passing a resolution. And many a times these could be ceremonial, they could be in honor of someone, or in honor of a day, or in honor of the passing of someone, or a significant figure in history, or a member of Congress, or a past president. Some of these resolutions will come along in that regard. How do members vote? They basically vote along two models, and Magleby talks about this. The delegated model, which is basically you vote the wishes of the people that elected you, and you basically vote along, take polls, and you basically vote along the lines of what they would want you to do. You're really their delegate. Or the trustee model, which I always say is really that they're trusting you to do what is right, to make decisions on their behalf. Not necessarily what they would want you to do, but you're doing it in the best interest of the people of your district. And those are tougher decisions to justify back home, but many times you have more knowledge and more information and more on the legislation to be able to make that decision. So, and there's sometimes where members of Congress will go back and forth on these types of issues, but the idea in terms of the model that they use, many times they'll vote the wishes of their constituents back home, and many times they'll vote on what they think is right, not necessarily what their constituents want them to do. They're trusting in their delegate, they're trusting in their member of Congress to do the right thing. So sometimes there is a shift back and forth in these two models. How do they possibly keep up with this much legislation being voted on essentially every day within the 2-year session? Nearly 8,000 bills being introduced. How can they possibly keep up with all this? Well, this is where information is so important by interest groups, lobbyists, and party members, by constituents, and by other members on their committees and members that are working with them. This is where staff are so important, the staff that work for them, because they are their researchers. They are their information go-to sources. And this is where interest groups can really help them on both sides, whether they're pro or con. They can gather information from both points of view using interest groups from both sides to basically provide them with information. And they may not be on this side with you now, but who knows, down the road, if you are a trusted source, they may be calling you in for other resources and opportunities that weren't there before. And that's the point. You want, as an interest group, as a lobbyist, you want to be that vital person that provides information. Even though they may not agree with you now, they may end up agreeing with you for something that's on your priority and your legislative agenda later. And that's the important piece that we see there. Congress is we know the president is the ultimate punching bag, but Congress is easy to hate because it's this body of 535 people that basically there's a lot of people doing stuff we don't know about, and it's easy to love our member of Congress but hate everybody else. And that's why they have such a low approval rating, right around 17% right now. We can see it's been lower. It's been in the lower teens, but right now around 17% in the latest. There always are allegations of a do-nothing Congress, approving of your members' performance back home, but not necessarily Congress in terms of what they're doing as a whole. And this continues to lead to problems and issues along the way, where people look at their member of Congress and say, hey, they're doing a great job, re-elect them, continue to send them back to Congress, but hey, throw the rest of the bums out. And this is where Congress gets the bad rap, because we don't know what other Congress members are doing. We only look at the one in our district, and we basically don't think a whole lot of the others because we don't know what's going on there. So that's where Congress really has a hard time trying to show their work, and especially in divided government, where you have Democrats controlling one body, either the Congress or the presidency, and Republicans controlling the other, and the divided government makes it even look even worse because nobody's getting anything done. We have gridlock, and that's where Congress looks even worse because the president can tout something, and Congress has really nothing to tout with divided government. If you have gridlock and you're not getting anything done, well, you've spent billions of dollars, and what have you done to show for it? Not a whole lot. And that's the point that they're trying to make there. I hope this has been helpful with Chapter 11, and wish you luck on the upcoming quizzes, tests, exams, and hope you found this helpful. Live the 5. We'll see you soon.